Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Usually when we talk about doing the right thing, there is this expectation of a clean, linear result.
Yeah, for sure.
Like, you put in the coin of ethical behavior, and you expect the universe's vending machine to dispense this sweet reward of a good, comfortable life.
Right. It feels like basic physics.
Yeah.
Action, reaction.
Yeah, you tell the truth, you get praise, you work hard, you get the promotion, you do the moral thing, and society applauds you.
But then you step into the reality of living in a fallen world.
And suddenly that vending machine is totally broken. Not only does it steal your coin, but the entire machine tips over and crushes you.
It is incredibly disorienting.
It really is. So I want to ask you, the listener, have you ever done the right thing, made the hard ethical choice, and instead of being rewarded, you were brutally punished for it?
That is the specific situation facing Joseph in the ancient text we are investigating today.
Which makes this historical account intensely relevant to your modern life. Today, we are pulling from some massive theological research to look at Genesis chapter 39. We are zeroing in on just a few verses, verses 19 through 23.
Right, because buried in the ancient Hebrew grammar, this terrifying moment in Joseph's life is the answer to how God operates when your world completely falls apart.
And it is the absolute definition of circumstantial muddy waters.
Oh, yeah. What is fascinating here is how this text shatters our modern comfortable assumptions. I mean, we live in an era where prosperity gospels and superficial pragmatism tell you that obedience guarantees immediate earthly comfort.
Like health, wealth, and vindication are treated as your automatic rights if you just have enough faith.
Right. But this narrative offers a radically different definition of prosperity. It forces us to define prosperity as the presence of God rather than the absence of pain.
That is a massive shift.
It is. This is not a text offering a 5-step plan to improve your daily mood. It is a historical record showing a man who maintained absolute moral purity, honored God perfectly, and was rewarded with a false accusation, burning wrath, and the cold irons of an Egyptian dungeon.
Right, and to grasp the theological weight of this event, we have to first look at the terrifying historical reality Joseph found himself in.
Yeah, we cannot look at this through the lens of modern criminal justice.
Not at all. We are talking about the patriarchal era, roughly the 19th century BC. Egypt is the ancient superpower of the world. It is saturated in polytheistic idolatry and rigid social hierarchies.
And Joseph is not a citizen?
No, he is a Hebrew slave, an alien with zero legal rights, and he is purchased by a man named Potiphar.
Right, and Potiphar is not just a wealthy guy with a nice house. The research highlights his title, and it is chilling.
Yeah, the Hebrew text gives him the title Sar Hatabakim,
which translates to the captain of the guard, or more precisely, the chief of the executioners.
Wow, the chief of the executioners.
Yeah, he is the head of Pharaoh's royal bodyguard. This means he is the man personally responsible for carrying out capital punishments against the enemies of the Egyptian state.
So his daily job involves violence and absolute state control.
Spot on. He holds absolute, unquestioned life and death authority over his household and his slaves.
Which brings up a really intense point about the cultural context of the ancient Near East. If a foreign slave is accused of assaulting the wife of a high-ranking official like the chief executioner...
There's no trial.
Right, there is no jury. There's no presumption of innocence.
No internal affairs investigation.
Yeah.
The customary legal response would be immediate, brutal death.
Which brings up something that has always tripped me up in this text. Potiphar's wife falsely accuses Joseph of attempted assault. Potiphar believes her, but the text says Potiphar puts Joseph in prison.
Yeah.
I have to stop you there because the research suggests this is a display of divine mercy. But if I am Joseph, sitting in a pitch-black, rat-infested hole after doing the right thing, I am not calling that mercy.
No, you would call it abandonment.
Yeah, I am calling that total abandonment. How do we reconcile the sheer physical misery of a dungeon with the idea of God's protection?
I mean, I understand that reaction completely. It looks like abandonment to the naked eye.
Yeah.
But you have to look at what should have happened according to Egyptian law and custom.
Okay, walk me through that.
Well, Potiphar's decision to put Joseph in prison rather than execute him is not a sign of human leniency.
Because the guy is the chief executioner.
Right. It is the invisible hand of God staying the executioner's blade. Potiphar had every legal right, and really the cultural expectation, to have Joseph beheaded or flayed on the spot in his own courtyard.
Wow.
The fact that Joseph breathes another breath, the fact that Potiphar restrains his lethal professional training is a staggering display of divine restraint over human wrath.
So God is holding back the logical consequence of Potiphar's anger.
Yes.
So the dungeon is the grace.
Yeah. As hard as that is to accept.
That is a hard pill to swallow. And the specific location where he ends up is fascinating, too. The Hebrew term used for this prison is Bet HaSohar. Moses notes this in the text.
Right. This is not the local county jail or a common holding cell.
It is a very rare term, right?
Yeah, it indicates a specialized fortified roundhouse or fortress beneath the captain of the guard's jurisdiction.
So it's under Potiphar's direct control.
Yes, and Moses specifically notes, this is a place where the king's prisoners were bound. It is a holding tank for political prisoners who offended the Pharaoh.
So it is an exclusive, high-security facility.
Completely.
I see where this is going. This is an architectural setup.
Oh, absolutely.
God is placing Joseph in the precise holding tank where he will eventually meet Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker.
Right, because if he goes to a regular common prison, he never meets the royal officials.
And if he never meets them, he never interprets their dreams.
He never gets recommended to Pharaoh.
And he never saves the known world from global famine.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals the doctrine of meticulous providence. The prison, intended by Potiphar as a place of punishment, was intended by God as a place of preparation and positioning.
The historical setting is the anvil upon which God is forging his redemptive plan for the entire covenant people of Israel.
Yeah, God does not just allow Joseph to go to prison. God actively ordains this specific high-security roundhouse because it is the only geographic location on earth where Joseph's path will intersect with the royal court.
That completely reframes how I look at unfair situations. But here's the detail that trips me up. The actual narrative reads so fast, it feels like God is totally absent while all this is happening.
Let's look at verses 19 and 20.
Yeah, I am struck by the sheer speed of human anger described here. The text uses a visceral Hebrew idiom for Potiphar's anger way shar apo.
Right.
It literally means his nose burned.
Yes, it is an intense physical description of uncontrolled wrath. Picture the physiological reaction of a man whose face flushes red, whose breathing becomes heavy and rapid.
Like a bull seeing red.
Pretty much. And when you analyze the syntax of these two verses, it is dominated by swift, aggressive human actions.
Walk us through those actions.
Well, the wife speaks the false words.
Yeah.
The master hears them. His nose burns with wrath. He takes Joseph. He puts him into the prison.
The narrative pace is incredibly fast.
It really is, mirroring the rapid execution of human injustice. Notice that syntactically, God appears totally absent from these sentences.
The clauses describe a complete, helpless descent into bondage.
Right. To the human eye, Joseph's life and destiny are utterly destroyed by a single lie.
But then we hit verse 21 and everything flips. This is the grammatical hinge of the entire chapter.
Yeah, in Hebrew, the way a sentence starts tells you everything about the action.
Usually it is a chain of events, right? Like, and he did this and she did that.
Right.
But right at verse 21, the grammar violently hits the brakes. Moses uses a specific conjunction called an adversative wa consecutive.
It basically functions as a massive flashing, however.
It is translated as, but the Lord was with Joseph.
Everything up to this point was human wrath, however.
I love this. It is like a sudden focal shift in a movie. Imagine the camera is tightly zoomed in on this chaotic room. Potiphar is screaming. His nose is literally burning. The wife is crying fake tears. The guards are dragging Joseph away in chains.
It is pure chaos.
Right, it's pure chaos. And then right at verse 21, the camera suddenly pulls way back out of the room up into the sky and reveals the director calmly sitting in a chair writing the script.
That is a great visual. The chaos is real, but it is entirely contained within the director's plan.
Spot on. The action shifts from human vengeance to divine presence.
And there is a critical detail in the authorial choice of words here. Moses does not use Elohim, which is the generic name for God as creator.
That is the word Joseph used earlier when speaking with Potiphar's wife, right?
Yes, when he said he could not sin against God. But here, in the darkness of the dungeon, Moses switches the name. He uses YHWH, the tetragrammaton.
Why does that matter? What is the difference between Elohim and YHWH in this context?
Well, YHWH is the covenantal, self-existent, redemptive name of God.
The name God uses when he makes promises to his people.
Right. It indicates an intimate, covenant-keeping presence. Moses is showing us that God does not just view Joseph from a distance as a generic creator.
Yahweh descends directly into the squalor of a pagan cell to sit with his covenant child.
The creator of the universe makes himself intimately present in a sunless Egyptian hole.
It is staggering. But it is not just that God is watching. The text defines specifically how God is present through two massive Hebrew concepts. We need to talk about cheesed and chen.
Right, because God does not just sit there quietly, he acts.
So let's unpack cheesed first.
Cheesed is one of the weightiest words in the entire Old Testament. It is often translated as steadfast love, loyal mercy, or covenant loyalty.
It is not a fickle, sentimental emotion.
No, not at all. It is a fierce, unbreakable oath. It is the love a king shows to his loyal subjects based on a sworn treaty.
And God physically extends his covenant loyalty down into the pit.
Right. Why use cheesed here instead of a generic word for love?
Good question.
Because Moses is showing the reader that Joseph's imprisonment did not sever him from the Abrahamic covenant.
A false accusation from a wicked woman cannot break the sworn oath of Yahweh.
God's promises are not canceled by human lies.
I love that. And then there is chen, which means favor or grace. The text says God granted Joseph favor in the sight of the prison keeper.
Yeah.
Now, I want you, the listener, to consider this for a second. The prison keeper is an Egyptian. He works for Potiphar. He is likely polytheistic, worshiping the gods of Egypt.
Definitely.
So, if God can grant Joseph favor with a pagan, unregenerate prison warden, does this mean God is micromanaging the emotional dispositions of the people around us? Are we saying God actively reached into this warden's mind and changed how he felt about Joseph?
This raises a massive theological point, and the answer points directly to the doctrine of providence. Yes, God is sovereign over the micro-details of human relationships and the internal dispositions of the human heart.
The syntax of the Hebrew highlights this beautifully, doesn't it?
It really does. The exact same Hebrew verb, naten, is used when Potiphar put Joseph in the prison and when God gave him favor.
Man gives the prison, Yahweh gives grace.
God turns the heart of the prison warden wherever he wills. He completely subordinates human wrath.
The unregenerate Egyptian warden functionally abdicates his authority to a Hebrew slave accused of assault, all because the chen of Yahweh rested upon him.
Right. The warden looks at Joseph and inexplicably trusts him because God ordained that trust.
Take that a step further. If that is true, what does this mean for our definition of prosperity? We see the text repeat that the Lord made Joseph to prosper. The Hebrew word is matzliach.
Yes.
The modern prosperity gospel guys would look at a prison cell and say, you lacked faith, brother. If you had faith, you would be out of those chains. You would be driving a gold chariot.
Because they define prosperity entirely by the removal of obstacles.
Right.
But the biblical text completely dismantles that carnal theology. True, biblical prosperity is not the removal of the chains. It is being made fruitful while wearing them.
The text repeats that whatever Joseph did, the Lord made it prosper, yet Joseph remains incarcerated at the end of the chapter.
God's presence does not guarantee the immediate removal of your trial, but it guarantees that your labor within the trial will be fruitful for his redemptive purposes.
Joseph is prospering because God is with him, even though his address is a dungeon.
And Moses is a master literary architect. The way he builds this chapter forces you to see that truth visually in the text.
We see a brilliant literary framing device here called an inclusio, right?
Yes, an inclusio. That is when a writer begins and ends a section of text with the same phrase or concept, creating a boundary around the narrative.
So how does that work in Genesis 39?
Well, it opens in verses 2 and 3 by stating that God was with Joseph and prospered him in the captain's house.
Right.
Then we read the entire middle section, the seduction, the false accusation, the terrifying wrath, the arrest. Yeah. And then the chapter closes in verses 21 through 23 by stating the precise same thing. God was with Joseph and prospered him in the dungeon.
It is like structural bookends on a shelf. You can put anything you want in the middle of those bookends. Loss of status, vicious lies, relocation from a luxury estate to a rat-infested hole in the ground. But the bookends themselves remain identical.
God's presence is completely immune to geography.
He is not a local deity who gets locked out when the iron door slams shut.
No. God's presence in Potiphar's mansion is identical to God's presence in the prison.
Alongside those structural bookends, we also have the recurring motif of Joseph's garments. This is a tragic pattern in his life.
It really is. In Genesis 37, his brothers strip him of his special coat, dip it in goat's blood, and use it as false evidence to convince their father that Joseph is dead.
And here, in Genesis 39, Potiphar's wife grabs his garment as he flees her seduction, and she uses it as false evidence of a physical assault.
In both cases, a piece of clothing is used to construct a malicious lie that strips Joseph of his freedom.
It is incredibly unfair. He loses his freedom twice because of a piece of fabric. And if you read the preceding chapter, Genesis 38, The unfairness feels even more extreme. I always used to wonder why chapter 38 is awkwardly placed right in the middle of the Joseph story.
Chapter 38 acts as a dark foil. Moses deliberately juxtaposes the two narratives.
Oh, so?
Well, in chapter 38, Judah, Joseph's brother, commits grievous sexual sin with his daughter-in-law Tamar. He capitulates to pagan Canaanite practices. He acts with gross immorality.
Yet he seems to prosper in his family line. He goes home, his life continues.
Right. Then we flip the page to chapter 39. Joseph maintains absolute moral purity. When tempted by a powerful woman, he declares that giving in would be a great wickedness against God.
He flees.
And what is his reward for righteousness? A dungeon.
This destroys any simplistic view of immediate karma. If you just read chapters 38 and 39, it looks like sin pays off and righteousness gets you locked up.
It forces the reader to look at the long game of redemption, recognizing that God's justice and purposes operate on a timeline that exceeds our immediate circumstances.
To really grasp the full weight of this account, we have to consider the people who first heard it. We are talking about Moses' original audience.
Yes, these are the Israelites wandering in the Sinai wilderness after the Exodus.
They have just been liberated from 400 years of crushing slavery in Egypt.
They saw the 10 plagues, they saw the Red Sea part, but right now, they are in a harsh desert.
They are afraid, they are deprived of basic comforts, and they are constantly wanting to return to Egypt every time they get thirsty.
They are the ultimate complainers.
That historical setting is crucial. The wilderness generation was prone to perpetual murmuring. Whenever they faced a trial, their immediate reaction was to accuse God of abandoning them or trying to kill them.
Moses is setting the historical record of Joseph before them as a massive rebuke. Look at the stark contrast.
The Israelites complain bitterly about a lack of garlic, leeks, and onions.
Right. They have their freedom, they have the pillar of fire, but they complain about the menu.
Meanwhile, Joseph is stripped, enslaved, falsely accused of a heinous crime, and locked in a literal dungeon with no natural light and no hope of a fair trial.
Yet there is zero record in the text of Joseph complaining or murmuring against God. He does not curse his lot.
I want to point that directly at you, the listener. It is so easy to read about the Israelites and judge them for complaining about food. But hold your own complaints up to this standard.
We complain when the Wi-Fi is slow, or when our coffee order is wrong.
Or when we get passed over for a promotion, or when someone gossips about us at work. If Joseph can maintain his faith and quietly administer the prison in a lightless Egyptian hole, how can modern believers complain when facing minor inconveniences?
If the covenant-keeping God is with us, what right do we have to murmur?
Beyond rebuking their complaints, Moses is establishing the theological bedrock of divine sovereignty for this new nation.
The Israelites needed to know how they ended up in Egypt in the first place. Moses is teaching them that their 4 centuries of Egyptian slavery were not a cosmic accident.
They were not a failure of God's plan.
No, they were part of God's deliberate positioning. He is showing them a theology of the cross long before the actual cross. God's way to exaltation often leads straight through the valley of humiliation.
But there is a lingering tension here. You read about Joseph's perfect obedience, and it almost feels alien. It is intimidating.
Yeah, it really is.
If I'm honest, when I am wronged, I complain. When I am falsely accused, I want revenge. Which makes me wonder, is Moses just giving us an impossible moral standard here, or is Joseph's perfection actually a shadow of someone else?
It is definitely a shadow. All of this historical and literary setup seems to be pointing toward a much greater fulfillment centuries later.
Yes, we are talking about biblical typology.
Spot on.
Yeah.
A type is a divinely intended historical person, event, or institution that foreshadows the ultimate antitype, Jesus Christ.
This is not just an allegory where we look at clouds and try to see Jesus' face.
No, God writes history with rhyming patterns. Joseph stands as one of the most brilliant and comprehensive redemptive patterns in all of Scripture. The parallels are staggering.
Let's trace those parallels, because when you see them back to back, it's undeniable. Both Joseph and Jesus are beloved sons of their father.
Both are sent to their brethren, and both are violently rejected by them.
Both are sold for pieces of silver.
Both are stripped of their garments by their enemies.
Both are fiercely tempted to sin, yet remain completely sinless.
Both are falsely accused by wicked witnesses who twist their words and actions.
Both are cast into a pit or a grave.
And both are raised up and exalted by God to save a starving world from death.
The fingerprints of the Holy Spirit are all over this narrative, revealing the pattern of humiliation leading to exaltation.
Joseph saves the physical world from a famine of bread. Christ saves the spiritual world from a famine of righteousness. However, we must apply the pedagogical use of the law here.
We must let the text convict us. It is so easy to read this and cast ourselves as Joseph. I do it all the time. I read the story and think, yes, I am the misunderstood hero fighting for truth.
But the uncomfortable reality, and the research brings this out brilliantly, is that in our fallen state, human beings are Potiphar's wife.
We are deceitful, driven by carnal desires, manipulating the truth to get what we want.
Or we are Potiphar blind to reality, governed by our own wrath, executing unjust judgments based on bad information.
Or we are the brothers selling out our family out of sheer jealousy.
We are not naturally Joseph.
This drives home our desperate need for a true and better Joseph. We need a substitute. We need someone to live the perfect life we failed to live.
And that leads to the most striking theological contrast between the type and the antitype. Up to this point, we have seen similarities. But here is the massive difference.
What is it?
The text in Genesis 39 explicitly states, "The Lord was with Joseph in the dungeon." Joseph experienced the comforting cheese of God in his darkness.
Right.
But when Jesus Christ went to the cross, bearing the sins of his people, he experienced something Joseph never did. Christ experienced the infinite penal wrath of God. He experienced the terrifying absence of the Father's favorable presence.
That is the cry from the cross. My God, why hast thou forsaken me?
Precisely. Christ took the full measure of divine wrath. He took the isolation, the abandonment, and the punishment that our sins deserved.
Christ was forsaken by God so that believers could receive the steadfast love mentioned in verse 21.
Christ took the real dungeon of God's wrath so that in our earthly dungeons we only ever experience God's grace.
Jesus was forsaken so that you would never be forsaken in your darkest moment. That is the gospel in a single sentence.
Okay, let's take this high theology of Christ's substitution and bring it down to the dirt floor of your daily life. Let's talk about application for the listener's own prison. How does this ancient text change how we act tomorrow morning?
Well, the first application is the demand for holiness, regardless of the cost. Joseph teaches us that sin is fundamentally a crime against God, not just a social misstep or a breaking of human rules.
Right. When Potiphar's wife tempted him, he said, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?"
He did not say, I might lose my job. He did not say, Potiphar will kill me.
His primary concern was the holiness of God. He fled temptation even though it cost him his physical freedom and his reputation.
In our modern context, we are often tempted by pragmatism. The culture suggests that we should compromise our ethics to save our careers, to maintain our reputations, or to keep our social standing.
If telling a small lie saves a huge business deal, the culture says tell the lie.
We must reject that entirely. A clean conscience in a prison cell is infinitely better than a defiled conscience in a palace.
Joseph shows us that obedience to God is the highest priority, even when obedience triggers a catastrophic loss of earthly comfort.
I also want to look at Joseph's reaction to the prison in verses 22 and 23.
This blows my mind every time I read it.
He gets thrown into this roundhouse knowing he is totally innocent. What does he do?
He does not stage a hunger strike.
He does not sit in the corner formulating a plot for revenge against Potiphar's wife.
He does not write letters protesting his innocence. He works. He actively administers the prison. The warden puts him in charge of the other prisoners.
He takes stewardship of his confinement. He applies his God-given administrative gifts to the bleakest environment imaginable.
It is like being stuck in a terrible, depressing waiting room. Maybe it is a doctor's office, and you have been waiting for hours, and you are angry and frustrated.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Instead of angrily staring at the clock and complaining to the receptionist, you stand up, start organizing the magazines, sweep the floor, and begin comforting the other patients. He takes ownership of the space he is confined to.
We can apply this directly to you, the listener. You might find yourself in a circumstance that feels like a prison.
It could be a difficult, painful marriage where you feel totally unseen.
It could be a toxic, unjust workplace where you are passed over for promotions while dishonest people get ahead.
It could be a season of severe physical suffering where your own body feels like a cage you cannot escape. We all have those environments where we feel trapped.
The mandate of this text is that you cannot wait for your circumstances to improve before you decide to honor God.
You are called to be a faithful steward of the specific prison you are in right now.
Do not wait for the chains to fall off before you begin to act with integrity. God is with you in that specific trial, and He expects you to bear fruit right where you are planted, even if you are planted in the dark.
So what is our core discovery today? True prosperity is the presence of God, even in the absolute darkest of circumstances. Injustice is real, and it hurts immensely, but it is never the final word when God's invisible hand is managing the script.
Human lies and human wrath are completely subordinated to divine providence. God uses the wicked actions of humans to position his people precisely where they need to be.
As we conclude, I want to leave you with a concept to mull over.
Think about the massive redemptive scale of Joseph's story. God took a malicious lie from a scorned woman in a patriarchal Egyptian household, and he used that specific lie as the mechanism to position a man to save the entire ancient world from starvation.
Thereby preserving the lineage of Judah that would one day bring forth the Messiah. It is an incredible chain of events.
Now look at your own life. What frustrating microscopic detail, what unfair delay, or what unjust circumstance in your current situation is actually an architectural setup for a future grace you cannot even fathom yet?
If God can use an Egyptian dungeon to save the world, what is he doing with your current frustration? If the director is writing the script, even the broken vending machines in the dark holding cells have a purpose. You are never abandoned.
Such a vital truth to hold on to.
Sure.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay faithful, and we will see you next time.